Have you ever spent Christmas alone, surrounded by memories of a past you'd rather forget? What if I told you that a simple night of nostalgia could turn into your worst nightmare? In this story, you'll discover how a small, hidden gift brought to light a family's dark secrets, and that not all memories should be unearthed. Get ready, because what you're about to hear will make you think twice about revisiting the past. Let's get started with this mysterious story, but first, quickly check if you're already subscribed to the channel. That way, you'll be sure not to miss any of the most chilling stories we've prepared especially for you. Continuing, Marcos was tired. It wasn't just the kind of physical tiredness that comes from working long hours. It was something deeper, a weight on his soul. After years of dealing with the hustle and bustle of the big city, the incessant noise and the pressure of a suffocating job, he felt disconnected from everything and everyone. When December arrived, with the lights twinkling in the windows and the happy advertisements on TV, he realized that he didn't have the energy to join in the celebrations. He wanted, or rather needed, silence. That's when the idea came to him to spend Christmas in the old family home in the countryside. It had been decades since he had set foot there. Since his parents passed away, the place had been abandoned, covered in the dust of time and memories that he would rather forget. It was a sudden, almost impulsive decision, but it made sense to him. The house was in a small village, surrounded by fields and few people. It would be the perfect refuge to escape the chaos. Marcos got into his car on December 23rd, threw a suitcase in the back seat, and set off at dawn. The drive was long, but as he left the city behind, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He had always believed that places carried energy, and this house, well, it was different. It wasn't that he was superstitious, but there was something about it that made him hesitate. Why, after all these years, did he feel the need to go back now? He arrived late in the afternoon, as the sky turned orange and purple. The house was exactly as he remembered it, an old wooden building with peeling paint and dusty windows. The trees around it seemed taller, denser, almost as if they wanted to hide the place from the rest of the world. When Marcos opened the rusty gate and took his first step into the yard, he felt a shiver run down his spine. It wasn't cold, but a feeling of being watched. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. "Nonsense," he muttered to himself. He pushed open the front door, which creaked as if protesting his arrival. The smell was familiar, old wood, dust, and something he couldn't identify, maybe mold. Deep down, the house was still the same, but it seemed darker, more cramped. The furniture was covered in yellowed sheets, and the silence was almost oppressive. Marcos dropped his suitcase on the floor and sighed. He had come here looking for peace, but now he wondered if he had made the right choice. As he walked around the room, running his fingers over the dusty surface of a sideboard, flashes of his childhood came to mind. The Christmas tree always stood there, next to the fireplace. He remembered the smell of cookies baking, his parents' laughter, and the silence that followed the disappearance of Lucas, his younger brother. Swallowing hard, Marcos shook his head again, as if he could erase the memories. He had come to forget, not to relive the past. He climbed the creaky stairs to the room that used to be his and opened the window, letting in the fresh air. The view was as peaceful as he had imagined, snow-covered fields and a starry sky. Perhaps as the night wore on, he would be able to find the peace he so desperately sought. But something was wrong. He knew it. There was a reason why this house called him back, even if he could not yet understand it, and that reason had nothing to do with nostalgia or peace. Marcos couldn't explain the exact reason that led him to return to that house. It wasn't just nostalgia or a desire to relive the past. It was something deeper, more visceral. Since the beginning of December, he had been having strange dreams, always with the same setting, the old family home covered in thick fog. In the dreams, he saw Christmas lights twinkling in the windows, but there was no sound of laughter or familiar voices. The silence was so dense that it seemed like screaming. The first time he ignored it, thinking it was just his mind playing tricks. But the dreams continued, increasingly vivid. One night he woke up gasping for breath, with his heart racing as if he had just run away from something. The detail that disturbed him the most was the presence of an indistinct figure in the dreams, standing in the garden. It was impossible to identify the face, but it seemed familiar. During the day, even when he was away from home, he began to feel as if he were being followed. A chill would follow him at the most random moments, at work, while he was drinking coffee, even while he was crossing the street. Whenever he thought about Christmas, his mind would return to home. It was as if something or someone was pulling him there. In the last week before Christmas, the feeling became so strong that it seemed unbearable. He had not been in touch with the house for years, but suddenly he began to remember details that he thought he had forgotten. The sound of the wall clock in the living room, the creaking of the stairs, the smell of burning wood in the fireplace. These memories came without warning, as if the house itself were whispering to him, and there was more. He began to notice strange things around him. Some nights, as he looked out the apartment window, he seemed to see shadows moving on the street. One day, he found a note that he was sure had not been there before, lying on the floor of his office. It was blank, but the smell of the paper reminded him of the house, that same smell of old wood and mold. When he finally made the decision to return, Marcos felt a mixture of relief and fear. It was as if he was answering a call that he could no longer ignore. He told himself that it was just to rest, that he needed a quiet place to escape the chaos of the city. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just that. The house wanted him back, and he had no choice but to comply. As he crossed the rusty gate and stepped onto the ground covered in dry leaves, Marcos felt a strange familiarity. It wasn't just longing, it was as if he had never really left. The feeling of being watched returned, but this time it didn't feel threatening. It was like a cold but welcoming hug. It was the kind of connection you feel with something old, something that carries memories that your mind has tried to erase. As he opened the door and stared into the dark interior of the house, he wasn't sure exactly what was waiting for him. He was only certain of one thing: he wasn't there by chance. Something had brought him back, and he was about to find out what it was. As soon as Marcos crossed the threshold of the old house, a wave of nostalgia enveloped him, like a heavy but uncomfortable blanket. He smelled the unmistakable smell of old wood, accumulated dust, and something he couldn't identify. Maybe it was time, that bittersweet odor that only forgotten places carry. The dim light of the evening invaded the room through the cracks of the dusty windows, projecting shadows that danced unsettlingly on the walls. Marcos stopped for a moment, trying to adjust his eyes to the darkness. Every detail seemed frozen in time. The old sideboard in the living room, still with the marks of glasses that his mother always complained about. The wall clock stopped at 11:45, as if the hands had given up counting the hours, and the cracked mirror in the hallway, which reflected a distorted version of what was left of that house, and perhaps of himself. He closed the door behind him and realized how absolute the silence was. There was not a sound from outside, not the rustling of trees, not the chirping of birds. It was as if the house was isolated from the world, existing in a bubble of its own. This absence of noise was so thick that it made Marcos hear his own heart beating faster and faster. As he walked through the living room, the wooden floor creaked beneath his feet, as if the house were reacting to his presence. He ran his fingers over a piece of dust-covered furniture and felt its rough texture mixed with memories that surfaced without warning. He remembered his father sitting in the armchair next to the fireplace, always reading the same yellowed newspaper, and his mother decorating the Christmas tree with colorful baubles and twinkling lights. But these images were quickly replaced by another, the night Lucas, his younger brother, disappeared. Marcos tried to push the thought away, but it was impossible. The energy of the house seemed to pulse, bringing back feelings and memories that he had buried. He felt a tightness in his chest, as if something invisible was hugging him, not with comfort, but with a cold, possessive touch. As he climbed the stairs to the second floor, he noticed something curious. Although the rooms were covered in dust, there were no signs of deterioration. It was as if the house was waiting for him. When he reached the hallway, he noticed that one of the doors was ajar. It was the room that used to be Lucas's. He hesitated. Something inside him told him not to go in, but his curiosity got the better of him. Slowly, he pushed the door open with his fingertips. The room was almost intact. The bed was made, the toys lined up on the shelf, and the red metal car that Lucas loved was standing on the floor, as if it had been left there the day before. It was impossible. Marcos knew that no one else took care of that house. As he looked around, a cold sensation ran down his spine. He had the distinct impression that he was not alone. Turning around quickly, he saw only the empty hallway. But the mirror next to the stairs reflected something that was not there, a shadow standing behind him. Marcos closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and tried to convince himself that he was just tired. He had come to rest, to reconnect with himself. But with each step he took inside that house, it became clearer that it was not just a shelter for memories. It was alive, and something in it was waiting for him. When he went back down to the living room, something caught his attention. In the corner where they always put up the Christmas tree, there was a structure that looked like it had been left there for years. He approached it and realized that it was the family's old tree, now dry, with its fragile branches covered in dust and cobwebs. The strange thing was that right under it, there was a single present. A small box, wrapped in faded red paper and with a golden ribbon that seemed to resist the passage of time. Marcos frowned. He was sure that the house had been empty and abandoned since his parents' death, so who would have left it there? He knelt down slowly, feeling the cold floor under his knees. He took the present in his hands, and its weight was strange, too light, as if it were empty. Marcos looked at the tag attached to the ribbon. His heart stopped for a moment when he read what was written, in a childish but unmistakable handwriting, "To Marcos, from your brother Lucas." A chill ran through his body. It was impossible. Lucas had been missing for decades, and yet this gift looked new, as if it had just been placed there. He clutched the box in his hands, hesitating whether or not to open it. The air around him grew colder, and the silence in the house seemed increasingly oppressive. Something inside him told him that this gift was more than it seemed. Marcos hesitated for a few seconds, staring at the small box in his hands. His heart was beating so fast that it seemed to echo through the silence of the house. Something inside him screamed not to open it, but curiosity, or perhaps the call that had brought him there, was stronger. With trembling fingers, he undid the golden ribbon and carefully tore the faded red paper. The lid of the box creaked slightly as he opened it, and what he saw inside left him cold. It was an old photo from when he and Lucas were children. In the image, they were in front of the same Christmas tree, laughing, with presents scattered around. But the detail that chilled Marcos's blood was something he didn't remember existing before. In the background, right behind the two of them, there was a tall, indistinct shadow, with a shape that looked human, but without a face. Marcos picked up the photo carefully, feeling as if the paper was colder than it should have been. The back had something written in blurred, but still legible letters. "Do you remember the promise you made?" He didn't understand. Promise? What promise? His mind spun as he tried to find a rational explanation, but a forgotten memory slowly began to emerge. He had made a promise to Lucas the Christmas he disappeared, but he couldn't remember exactly what it was. Suddenly a sound echoed through the house, a low noise like a whisper coming from somewhere. The air seemed to grow heavier, and Marcos realized that the room was darker, as if the walls were closing in around him. He held the photo tightly, feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger, something he was not prepared to face. Marcos froze in place, clutching the photo to his chest. The sound that had previously seemed like a whisper began to grow louder, as if voices were murmuring together, but in a language he didn't recognize. He looked around, trying to identify the source, but it was as if the walls of the house were alive, emitting that suffocating sound. The whispers seemed to be calling him, indistinct words but with a familiar, almost childish tone. One voice stood out among the others, low and trembling. "You promised, Marcos." His heart stopped for a moment. He knew that voice. It was Lucas's voice. Without thinking, Marcos stood up, the gift still in his hands. The house, which had previously seemed still, now seemed to pulse around him, every corner exuding a presence that he couldn't see, but that he knew was there. Before we continue with the video, just check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because here we will bring a series of videos like this with incredible, terrifying stories for you. We continue. Marcos was standing in the middle of the room when he heard a click. It was quiet, but enough to cut through the oppressive silence. He turned his head toward the sound and saw the basement door, the one that was always locked, slowly opening, as if something was pushing it from the inside. The creaking of the hinges seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the empty house. Marcos swallowed hard. He had never liked that basement when he was a child. It was dark, damp, and his mother always told him not to go down there alone. Now the door was open, revealing only a staircase plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, clearly coming from down there. Marcos felt a lump in his throat. He knew he shouldn't go down, but something, the same force that had brought him to the house, seemed to be pushing him toward that dark abyss. With hesitant steps, Marcos began to descend the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight, the sound echoing like a warning. The air in the basement was heavy, damp, and had a musty smell mixed with something metallic, like blood. When he reached the last step, the whispers abruptly stopped, leaving an even more frightening silence. He looked around, using the dim light of a flickering lamp on the ceiling. Among old boxes and furniture covered in sheets, something shone in the corner of the room. It was a small music box with a gold finish that looked new, clashing with everything else. He approached it, as if drawn to it. As soon as he touched the object, the melody began to play on its own. It was a familiar song, the same one Lucas loved to listen to as a child. Marcos felt a shiver when he realized that the sound was not coming only from the box. It seemed to echo throughout the house. Mark watched the music box spin slowly, its soft melody echoing through the basement. It was mesmerizing, and at the same time, deeply unsettling. He noticed something engraved on the inside of the lid, like a handwritten inscription. Bending down to get a better look, he read the words, "Remember the promise, I'm waiting for you." Mark's heart raced. The handwriting was Lucas's. He was sure of it. But how could something like that be there? The last time he had seen that box was the Christmas that Lucas disappeared. Suddenly, the melody stopped abruptly, leaving the basement plunged into absolute silence. Mark felt a presence behind him, a sensation so intense that he could barely breathe. The silence was so deep that Marcos could hear the sound of his own heart hammering in his chest. He quickly closed the music box and turned around, feeling the cold of the basement grow even more intense. In the darkest corner, where the light from the flickering lamp couldn't reach, he saw something move. It was a shadow, tall and shapeless, that seemed to be writhing as if it were alive. Marcos stepped back, bumping into an old bookshelf as the shadow approached, slowly and deliberately. "Marcos." The voice was low, drawn out, and seemed to come from inside his own mind. He recognized the tone. It was Lucas, but something was wrong. The voice didn't have the same innocence as before. It sounded empty. The shadow stopped a few steps away from him, and for a moment it seemed to be looking directly at him, even though it didn't have eyes. Marcos felt panic rising, but he was paralyzed. The shadow remained motionless for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity. Then, as if it was waiting for the right moment, it tilted its head, or something like that, towards Marcos. "You left him alone," whispered the voice, cold and accusing. Marcos felt a lump in his throat. The words hit him like a punch. He tried to deny it, but something inside him knew it was true. That night, years ago, he had distanced himself from Lucas, even if only for a few minutes. Enough for his brother to disappear forever. I didn't want to—" Marcos stammered, his voice breaking, but the shadow came closer, almost touching him, and added, "He waited for you. And now he wants you to keep your promise." Marcos's mind was spinning. He didn't understand exactly what the shadow wanted to say, but the guilt he had been carrying for years seemed to come to life there, in the basement. It was as if the house, or whatever was in it, was forcing him to face something he would rather forget. So, had you ever heard of stories in treehouses? Leave a comment with what you know about this, and if you believe in these stories. Continuing. Suddenly, the ground beneath Marcos' feet seemed to give way. He felt a strong pull, as if the house itself was swallowing him. Darkness surrounded him, and he fell into an endless void. When he finally opened his eyes, he was no longer in the basement. He recognized the place immediately. It was the living room of the house, but not as it was now. Everything seemed new, full of life. The Christmas tree was set up with twinkling lights, and the smell of fresh food filled the air. It was the night of Lucas's disappearance. Marcos saw his younger self sitting on the floor, laughing with Lucas, who was holding the same music box. He tried to get closer, but realized that no one could see or hear him. It was like a spectator trapped in a nightmare. He watched the scene unfold, remembering it with painful clarity. His mother called for him in the kitchen, and impatient, Marcos left Lucas alone for a few minutes. That's when it all happened. The front door, which he was sure was locked, slowly opened. Lucas, curious as ever, put down the music box and walked over to it. "Lucas, no!" Marcos shouted, but it was no use. He just watched as his brother disappeared into the darkness beyond the door. The shadow appeared again, this time beside the open door. It seemed to be waiting, staring at Marcos as if to say, "Do you remember now?" Marcos watched helplessly as the younger version of himself walked back into the living room, only to realize that Lucas was no longer there. The despair on his face was palpable, and Marcos, as a spectator, felt the weight of guilt multiply. Then the scene changed. Now he was in a snow-covered field, not far from the house. He recognized the place. It was where he and Lucas had played as children. There, as if in a distorted dream, he saw the two of them together, sitting on the ground, with little Lucas holding the music box. "Promise you'll never leave me alone?" Lucas asked, looking at him with bright, innocent eyes. Marcos, in the scene, smiled and replied, "I promise, Lucas. We'll always be together." The memory hit Marcos like a thunderclap. He had completely forgotten the promise he had made that cold afternoon. And it was exactly that promise that he had broken on the night of his disappearance. The shadow appeared again next to the two brothers, like a silent witness. It whispered in his mind, "He waited. He's still waiting." Marcos felt tears running down his face. Now he understood. That house, those voices, everything was connected to the broken promise. But what could he do now, so many years later? Well, we're already unraveling more and more of this story, but before I continue, I realize that you still haven't liked this video, which is very important for YouTube to help promote our content. So, leave your like on this video, which is free, okay? Let's move on. The shadow seemed to grow in front of Marcos, taking on a more defined form. Although it was still indistinct, there was something about it that now seemed human, but distorted, as if it were trapped between two worlds. The environment around him began to transform again. The snowfield disappeared, and Marcos found himself back in the house, but something was different. The walls were covered in marks, like hastily made scratches, and the room seemed to pulse with an oppressive energy. The shadow spoke again, but this time its voice was clear and unmistakable. "He's trapped. You left him here, and now only you can free him." Marcos felt the weight of those words like a stone on his chest. He didn't know what it meant exactly, but he understood that Lucas was somehow connected to that house, or to the thing that lived in it. Lucas. "Where is he?" Marcos asked, his voice breaking as tears ran down his face. The shadow extended a thin, elongated hand, pointing to the basement. Suddenly the music box, which he was still holding, began to play on its own, but now in a distorted, almost threatening tone. The melody echoed through the house, and Marcos knew that the answer was there, in the place he feared most. With hesitant steps, he descended into the basement again. This time, the room was much darker, as if something was absorbing all the light. In the center of the room, a circle marked on the floor glowed faintly, and inside it was something small, covered by an old cloth. Marcos approached, feeling his heart almost burst in his chest. As he pulled the cloth away, he found a small notebook, its cover worn and full of stains. He recognized it immediately. It was Lucas's diary, which he thought had disappeared along with his brother. With trembling hands, he opened it to the last written page, where there was only one sentence, scribbled as if written in a hurry. "He's here with me. I can't leave." Before he could process its meaning, Marcos felt the environment around him change again. The walls of the basement seemed to close in, and the air became almost impossible to breathe. The shadow was there, closer than ever, almost touching him. "You have to finish what you started, Marcos," whispered the shadow, but this time its voice sounded different. There was something familiar about her, something that made Marcos shiver. It was as if a part of Lucas was trapped in that entity, calling out to him, asking for help. Marcos realized he had no choice. The weight of guilt, of the broken promise, everything was pushing him forward. He knew that if he didn't face it, Lucas would be lost forever, and maybe him too. Marcos knew he could not go back. With Lucas's diary in his hands and the shadow now completely around him, he felt that the house was alive, pulsing with the accumulated energy of years of pain and guilt. The circle on the floor shone more intensely, illuminating symbols he had never seen before, but which seemed ancient, charged with an incomprehensible power. The voice of the shadow returned, but now it seemed more intense, a mixture of anger and despair. "You broke the promise, and now there is only one way." Marcos took a deep breath, trying to control the panic that rose in his throat. He knelt before the circle, instinctively placing the diary in the center. The entire house shook, as if reacting to that gesture. The pages of the diary began to turn by themselves, stopping at a new sentence that had not been there before. "To free him, you must remember." The memory came like a flash, clear, brutal, and inescapable. Marcos saw himself, on the night of the disappearance, running out of the house after realizing Lucas had left. He called out for his brother in the darkness, the snow falling heavily around him, but found nothing but silence. But there was something else, something he had blocked from his mind for all those years. He saw the figure of a man, a tall, hooded presence, holding Lucas by the arm. The boy was crying, trying to get away as the man disappeared into the forest. Marcos remembered running after them, screaming until his voice was gone, but he stopped. He gave up. Fear paralyzed him. I left him, Marcos whispered, the weight of the truth falling on him like an avalanche. He had never told anyone this, not even himself. Guilt and fear had consumed him so much that he had buried the memory deep in his mind. But now it was there, raw and inescapable. The shadow advanced, now clearly taking the form of Lucas. His brother's face was distorted, a mixture of pain and anger. "You left me alone," Lucas said, his voice echoing in every direction. "You ran, Marcos. You promised to protect me." Marcos fell to his knees, tears streaming freely. I know. I was wrong. I was weak." His voice was shaking, but there was a growing strength within him. He looked directly at the shadow, facing it for the first time. "But I'm here now, and I won't leave you alone again." With those words, the circle began to glow brightly, illuminating the basement as if the sun itself were there. The shadow, once menacing, seemed to hesitate, retreating slightly. The house shook again, as if resisting what was happening. Marcos picked up the music box and opened it, letting the soft melody fill the room. "Lucas," he said firmly, "if you can hear me, come back. I'm here for you. This time, I won't run away." The shadow stopped retreating and slowly began to change. Lucas's face, previously distorted, became clearer, more human. His eyes, filled with tears, met Marcos's. "I just wanted you to come get me," Lucas said, his voice like that of a lost child. The brightness of the circle grew until it became unbearable. Marcos felt a burst of energy, as if the house itself was screaming, and then everything went silent. When he opened his eyes, the basement was empty. The music box was in his hands, but the circle and the shadow had disappeared. On the floor beside him was the diary, now with a new message written on it. "Thank you for not leaving me alone." Marcos felt a huge weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt no guilt, only sadness, but a sadness he could bear. He knew Lucas was at peace now. As he climbed the stairs to leave the house, he looked back one last time. The melody of the music box still echoed softly, like a farewell. Marcos smiled, clutching the diary to his chest, and whispered, "I kept my promise." And so, Marcos left the house. But did he really free himself from what happened that night? Or was it just the beginning of something even deeper and darker? How many of us carry unfulfilled promises, buried secrets, and fears we avoid facing? What if the things we leave behind never really leave us? This story is a powerful reminder that not everything that is buried stays dead. But what about you? Have you ever wondered what mysteries may be hidden in the darkest corners of your own life? Would you have the courage to face them? If you liked this story, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because the darkest secrets are yet to come. In the next videos, you will discover even more disturbing stories that will make you question everything you believe. Now tell me, do you really believe that Marcos is free, or is something still waiting for him patiently in the darkness? Leave your opinion in the comments and get ready, because the next video may be even more terrifying. Are you ready to continue this journey?